Hi, I hope everybody can see and hear me. My name is Sylvia Schwag-Sörger. I'm Professor of Research Policy at the University of Lund in Sweden, and I'm coming to you today from Malmö in southern Sweden, where we've had sunshine for the first time in several months. I would like to welcome all of you to this panel, which will be about transformative innovation policy, and more specifically, two recent flagship policy initiatives by the OECD and the Joint Research Center at the European Commission, respectively. And perhaps in a broader context, what we're trying to discuss today from an academic perspective, but also a policymaking perspective, is what is the shift to transformative innovation policy that we're witnessing? What does it mean for what kind of support policymakers need, how policymaking and academia can interact, and what kind of analyses and research perhaps will be required or are already underway to accompany this significant shift, I guess we argue, in policymaking, both in focus and in ambition, and perhaps also in form. So I would like to encourage all of you who are participating. We're very happy to have you here on a Friday afternoon to maybe post in the chat where you are and who you are and where you are joining from. And I'm very happy to sort of take you through this panel today. So the plan for this is that we will start with two policymakers. And as you will see in this panel, a lot of people who we call policymakers actually also have academic hats and vice versa. And maybe this is the nature also of this shift to transformative innovation policy. But we will start with the perspective of two policymakers on what needs they perceive in their daily work, trying to work with transformative innovation policy, and what demands or needs they see with regard to research or policy analysis. And then we will move to these two flagship policy initiatives from the OECD and the JRC, and they will be presented by Michael Keenan and Dimitrios Pontikakis, who are running these initiatives. And then we will finish off with two academics who, as you will also see, also have relevant policy experience, who will, Elvira Uyara and Paula Kivima, who will provide us sort of with their perspective from academia. How do they see this shift happening? How does this is affecting them? And what do they perhaps see happening going forward? And we very much welcome any kind of questions or comments or interaction from the audience. Unfortunately, we cannot see you, but if you post your questions in the chat, I will try to sort of pick them up and pose them to the panel. So any comments, questions that you agree, disagree, or what you would like to add would be highly welcome. I hope I've covered everything in my introduction. The point is that the panelists will be rather brief, and they've told me I can be rather strict, so I'm hoping there will be room for interaction and discussion. And with that, I would like to kick off with Ian Hughes, who works with innovation policy at Enterprise Ireland, but also as an academic at the University College in Cork. And he will provide us with his sort of first input from a policymaking perspective. What needs and what are you dealing with, and what does this shift to transformative innovation policy mean for you? So please go ahead, Ian.
Thank you very much, Sylvia. So just to say, I have two jobs. So I work both in the Department of Further Higher Education, Research, Innovation and Science in a policy function, and also 2 days a week as an academic in the Marai Centre in University College Cork. So in my comments, I'm going to share a little bit of my experience from both sides of the fence, if you like. And just to start off by saying, I think all of us who are involved in this have realized that innovation policy has just become much more complicated. So the urgency of societal challenges, particularly climate change and environmental destruction, have placed new demands on innovation policy to play a key role in averting severe social and environmental consequences. One framing that has emerged in recent years, as you know, is that of missions, whereby governments play the lead role in bringing together and steering a network of actors to achieve a particular societal goal, for example, reduce carbon emissions or reduce deaths from cancer. This means, though, that policymakers now have two framings for innovation policy, both of them running in parallel. So we have the National Innovation System framing that we are probably all used to, and which has been the basis for national innovation policy for decades. And now we have this new mission-driven innovation framing. In fact, it's even more complicated than that. since missions are actually a tool within a broader framing of system transitions, aimed at transforming from one socio-technical system, a carbon-based energy system, for example, to a different system configuration, a renewable energy-based system. But from a policymaker's perspective, this is extremely challenging, and for a variety of reasons. So, for example, policies, practices, and institutions for national innovation systems already exist and are well established. Those for system transformation, however, largely do not yet exist. So there's a question there in terms of how, moving forward, do we go for evolution of existing systems, or do we set up separate systems for the parts of system transformation that NIS doesn't address? That in itself is a complicated question. The tasks involved in system transformation, so for example, bringing together the networks that are needed, the financing required, steering the directionality of the entire process, creating the guiding vision for the transformation, and so on. All of these are extremely challenging in themselves, individually, as individual challenges. System transformation also requires the inclusion of actors who were previously largely excluded within the NIS framing, often actors who are critical for changing the system, but whose inclusion was previously seen as either unnecessary or indeed maybe too troublesome. Also, it's not obvious what role innovation policymakers will play in the overall transformation process. There's no doubt that innovation has a role in many missions. So just to quote some of the ones from the European Commission on healthy oceans, for example, climate adaptation, reducing cancer, sustainable food, and so on. But the coordination, while innovation plays a role in all of these, the coordination of each of these missions probably lies outside innovation ministries. So the cancer mission, for example, would probably lie under the coordination of Ministry of Health, climate mission, perhaps under Ministry of Climate Change or Climate Action, whatever is appropriate in a particular member state. But this means that the relationship between the ministry responsible for innovation and the various ministries that are may be responsible for the coordination of different missions becomes central. And it becomes central at a time when the nature of that relationship and the various parsing out of roles, if you like, is still very uncertain. This complexity is perplexing, I think is the phrase I could use. Where I think the OECD and JRC could help here, I think, is in articulating the complexities and difficulties that are involved. The fact that we have these two parallel systems now, one of which is well established, the other which is still being built, and providing insights and starting points of getting the entire process going, on mobilization strategies, for example, for engaging the various diverse actors. And I think also, very importantly, to emphasize that some of the practices that we are used to, and I'm thinking here particularly of evaluation methodologies and practices, need to fundamentally change. So that's from the policy perspective. Looking at this with my academic hat on, I'm afraid the picture becomes even more complicated. I think the framings for both NIS and system innovation are too narrow for a true understanding of the nature of the fundamental societal transformation that is needed to address the existential challenges we face. I know that Johan Schott and Mark Hanger call this deep transition. In a project I am working on at University College Cork, we call it deep institutional innovation for sustainability and human development. The NIS mission and mission framings are largely socio-technical. They rely largely on techno-optimism, the belief that all we need to do is change the technology and we can go on living as we are. The framings for deep transition and DIIS, on the other hand, see the needed transformations in a much broader view. Coming transitions will not only require innovations in technology, but fundamental changes in our politics, our economics, our education, our culture, and a paradigm shift in the values that underpin our societies. This broader view, I think, is currently outside the framing of both NIS and system transformation, certainly the socio-technical framing of system transformation. But I think it's something that I believe that innovation policymakers too will have to grapple with. So those are my introductory remarks. So can I hand back to you now, Sylvia? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. I thought that was excellent for setting the frame. And what you're saying essentially is that innovation policy, as you said, has become a lot more complicated, and it's become challenging partially because it's complicated, but not only, but because, and also that we're dealing with parallel systems. So I think my spontaneous question, which I will park for now, would be, given that we're dealing of, as I understand you, with a significant shift in policy making, can existing structures handle this shift? And can these two systems, if I understand you correctly, promoting competitiveness, which was one of the traditional goals of innovation policy, versus promoting sustainability and transformation, can they coexist, or are there significant frictions between them? But maybe we can come back to that also with Tatiana, when Tatiana has done her presentation. But thank you very much. And I see that one person has posted. I know that a lot more have signed up for this session, where they're from and what they're interested in. So it would be great if some of you also could add to that. With that, I will switch over to Tatiana, and we will come back to Ian. And please post any questions you might have to Ian or his reflections. So Tatiana is in charge of innovation policy at the government of Catalonia, and she will present it from her work and experience from working with transformative innovation policy there. Please go ahead, Tatiana.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good afternoon. So as Sylvia said, I have worked the last 20 years in the regional government of Catalonia. So Catalonia in Spain is a dynamic and relatively rich region with 7 million inhabitants, and I am responsible for the coordination of Smart Specialization Strategy, which is the strategy that establishes the priorities for the regional European funds, particularly for those funds oriented towards research and innovation. I want to share my screen. Can I share yet? Okay. I hope you can see the. Okay. In Catalonia, we have conceptualized our mass specialization strategy as a research and innovation-driven transformative shared agenda to advance towards a more sustainable, inclusive, and fair socioeconomic system. The directionality of where we want to go is clear. We could say that the SDGs and the EU goals are our guiding star. So our focus is on how can we policymakers, together with researchers, companies, and society, address more effectively those challenges that really matter. As you may know, regional governments have not so much power in terms of normative capacity and funding. So for us, it's complicated to promote ambitious research and innovation missions. We need to collaborate with the other actors in the territory, building complicities and alliances to advance toward common goals. So in Catalonia, we are working with shared agendas. These are multi-actor coalitions of innovation-driven transformative change. In this slide, we can see some of the initiatives, projects, or experiments in which we have been working for the last 2 years, together with researchers and experts and with a diversity of actors engaged in transformative initiatives at the local and regional level. Working together for us is about exploring options and new possible pathways that suit each territory. A real example we are working on is how can a traditional rural area, for example, make the transition toward the bioeconomy. We are doing this by engaging in discussions and actions with producers, companies, academia, and civil society, rethinking our own roles and our own policies. What technology do we need? What investments do we need? How should we adapt the regulatory frame? Or how are we responding to the pressures of the landscape? Or what kind of alliances do we need to build? Or how can we build new business models and value chains providing alternatives to the unsustainable economic activities we have in the territory? Something that we have learned in the past years is that for researchers and policymakers, it's very difficult and complex to connect our actions to those problems and challenges that really matter. We don't like to work with uncertainty and complexity, but we live in times of radical uncertainty and complexity, so we have to embrace them. As I said yesterday in another session, for me, the key question is not how do we improve research and innovation policies or industrial policies. For me, maybe the key question is how do we change the dominant narratives and mindsets in order to make it possible that policymakers, together with academia, companies, and civil society, explore, co-develop, and implement more effective ways to address those challenges that really matter. And we should start by asking different questions, by integrating multiple perspectives, and by working with systems approaches. And as I also said yesterday, Transformative innovation is about managing conflict and expectations, and about building on these tensions to allow the emergence and consolidation of new possibilities. The key question is not how to avoid conflict, but how to manage conflict and how to avoid that vested interests stop us from doing what is so urgently needed. And here I would like to put in value all the frameworks developed by TIPSI that allows us to build a solid narrative and new experimental spaces for rethinking how policymakers with researchers, civil society, and companies can work together to address these complex challenges that really matter, not in the theory, but also in practice. In our discussions in Catalonia, we use this image, which illustrates quite well the challenges that policymakers are facing. It's important, of course, to take care of the old system, which concentrates most of the jobs, investments, and resources, and we need to support its transformation. But it's also very important to open the way for the emergence and consolidation of new alternatives with capacity to transform the system in the desired directions. Addressing these challenges requires a drastic shift in the dominant narrative, as I say. The discussion is not about choosing between the old and the new. It's not about deciding who are the winners and who are the losers. We need both the old and the new to build the future. So the problem arises when all the resources of the system are invested in the old system, and those actors with power don't allow the alternatives to emerge or want to decide which alternatives should be supported. So we are seeing this very clear in the energy sector, also in the automotive sector. So we live in a society in which we talk a lot about consensus, but in reality, we tend to polarize everything so that at the end, those with more economic power are the ones guiding the change. So I'd like to finish with an open question, and this would be, how can we accelerate system change by minimizing transitions costs and minimizing resistance without being caught up in the vested interests that have led us to the current situation? For me, this would be the main question to be answered. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tatiana, and thank you for leaving us with this quite relevant, very fundamental question, right? Which perhaps also points to the shifting nature of innovation policy, which might be different from dealing with incremental innovation and the way we've been dealing with innovation for a long time. I would now like to, these are the two policymakers' perspective, which I hope we can come back to, and I think which provided very good point of departure for what these policy initiatives might be trying to address. So with that, I would like to hand over to Dimitrios Pontikakis from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission and Michael Keenan from the OECD. I think Dimitrios will start and then hand over to Michael, and you have 7 minutes each. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Sylvia. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dimitrios Pontikakis. I work for the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Let me just start my presentation. The Joint Research Center, for those of you who do not know, is the European Commission's in-house science service. I will tell you a little bit about a relatively new project at the Joint Research Center that aims to develop a new generation of development strategies for regions, countries, and cities, which we call innovation strategies for sustainability. Innovation strategies for sustainability build on the successes of smart specialization strategy, but also very substantially expand upon them and infuse them with transformative innovation thinking. So why do we need S4? I think we can all agree that we're living through exceptional times. We need to act quickly to address climate change while leaving no one behind. This is simultaneously a momentous occasion to secure Europe's position in the economy of the future. Now is the time for a new approach to development strategies. And there are a number of maturing trends that point us in this direction. In addition to the technologies themselves and the transformation of production and consumption, key production and consumption systems, we now have a greater willingness in policy making to deploy the full panoply of industrial policy. Indeed, the European Union sees its future competitiveness as passing through sustainability. At the same time, there is a new scientific paradigm of innovation emerging. innovation scholars are emphasizing new ways to understand innovation and influence it. And we here at the JRC believe we have a role to play in helping our member states develop this new generation of development strategies based on our experience with mass specialization, and also supporting the Commission services and the member states in their recovery and resilience plans. So, what are innovation strategies for sustainability? We see them as much being as much an innovation and regional development policy as they are an industrial and employment or education and social policy. At the heart of S4 are impact-based strategies. In other words, we begin with the impact and with the societal outcome that we want to bring about. And then we work backwards from it to see who needs to be implicated and what needs to change. And very importantly, we do that in directions that combine economic, that create combined economic, social, and environmental value. Just like smart specialization, this is based on a governance framework that is participatory, that works with stakeholders. And in addition to smart specialization, however, we also need a new way of working across government department and levels, very much focused on the territorial challenges. These are very tough questions. So we have a team of leading scholars helping us pose the right questions and begin to answer them. We have a scientific committee on S4, which includes Sylvia Svag, which is here with us together, but also Paula Kivima, who will speak later. Our project on S4 involves building the concept, but also testing it in a small number of regions and countries in a joint pilot project we're launching with the European Committee of Regions. To support this pilot, we are currently, myself and a team of colleagues are currently very busily developing an initial guidance document, which we call the S4 Playbook. I will tell you a little bit more about that. We're also developing various tools and a research agenda, which we hope can also help respond to some of the pertinent questions raised by Ian and by Tatiana. I will begin with the suggestions by Ian, and that we at our project at the JSC and also the project at the OECD, we should articulate the complexities and difficulties of transition to this new frame of innovation. So I will speak a little bit about why the third framing is important and how we can begin to think in terms that are relevant for the third framing. We also need to provide insights, and I think international organizations such as the JSC and the OECD have a key role to play in providing policy intelligence. And also the strategies themselves are very important, both a formal strategy, a legal document, but also a shared agenda for change, which you can think of it as a meta dynamic strategy. And I will say a few words about this as well. So framing, why is framing so important? Framing is very important, and we need to, because it reveals structure. And a structure in a system can reveal points of leverage, ways for the system to change. A different framing, putting the way we understand the system under a different frame, can help us think differently about the future. It reveals perspective and allows us to make projections. So societal goals demand directionalities that have a broad framing. In order to do that, however, we need both to learn to work with new framings and unlearn previous framings. We need to recognize that some of the framings we have been using so far are loaded, have different purposes built in. And one of them, just to mention one, the quadruple helix, may not be suitable anymore for the particular transformations we need. We very frequently hear in evaluations of S3 that civil society was not as involved as other parts of the triple helix. Part of the problem is that many of the key actors in transformation, users of technology, financiers, regulators, professional associations, trade unions, educators, consumers, or workers who deserve equal or greater attention perhaps in this transition, many of them do not even fall under the dictionary definition for civil society. We should avoid prefabricated framings. The correct framing will vary from system to system and has to be discovered through examination. Ian raised a very important issue of reforming governance, and there's a big risk. We also need to dismantle old structures in addition to building new ones. The prevailing tendency is that of layering and accumulation, which creates tensions, and we need to find ways to reduce tensions and do what is needed. These are very, very tough questions, and we have no answers. We need to experiment. We need to explore approaches to doing this. We also need to find ways to work across government, and this will not involve a master plan where everything is choreographed. It requires a lot of autonomy and a lot of judicious choices by many individual public authorities and many stakeholders. The Marshall Plan, for example, came to be seen not as much of a plan, but rather a brilliant series of improvisations. And I think this is a good analogy for what needs to happen. And we also need new ways of evaluation, and we need to create these new ways of evaluation. We want to think like engineers who create a new machine that doesn't exist so far.
Dimitris, 2 more minutes.
Thank you, Sylvia. I will accelerate. You heard the suggestions by Tatiana, which are very, very important. We need to work with multi-actor coalitions. Like I said earlier, we need to begin with the goals, and we need to change not just knowledge and technology, but entire production and consumption systems. We need to simultaneously build the rationale, build the case for a transition, work forwards as well as backwards with many stakeholders. To do that, we also need to take the functional engine of smart specialization, the so-called entrepreneurial discovery process, which has worked very well for its given mission, and repurpose it for the mission of transformation. We can perhaps think, you can perhaps accuse me of wishful thinking of something like an open discovery process, where this stakeholder engagement creates multiple value. It works backwards from the goals, but in a multi-level perspective, not just at the territory, where the implicated stakeholders vary according to the goal and include other parts of government, and where stakeholders agree to open up their agendas and allow for synergies. Now, at the JSC, we're producing the S4 Playbook, which should be public in May, like I said. This should document leading thinking and practice on innovation, include key concepts, tools, approaches, and guiding principles. We are assembling it in-house with inputs from key experts, and we hope to have an online version that allows improvements over time and insertion of new tools and new approaches, and the learning and co-creation that emerges in the JSC Committee of Regions pilot. Another tool to navigate the transition, but not by far not one of the only, one of many, are the so-called point reviews we have piloted at the JSC under a common framework, projecting opportunities for industrial transitions, developed jointly with many colleagues, including Tatiana Fernandez from the government of Catalonia. The reviews allows us to assess a system through transformative framing and identify blind spots, especially through the demand side as well as very frequently neglected. The JSC will also be developing more tools such as the complexity compass, and it will be documented in the playbook. Thank you very much, and apologies, Sylvia, if I went a bit overboard with my timing.
It's okay, Dimitris, it wasn't too bad. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll hand over right away to Michael. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much, Sylvia. Dimitris is going to run my slides. So I'm going to talk today about an OECD project, a flagship project called Science and Technology Policy 2025, with the strapline of enabling transitions through science, technology, and innovation. Next slide, please. We heard some of the challenges a moment ago from Tatiana and from Ian. And these are challenges that we hear also from our OECD members who come to our committee meetings, who'd say they agree more or less with the messages around transformative innovation policy, but they don't know how to do transformative innovation policy. For example, how to operationalize normative goals like sustainability and inclusiveness in their existing policy mixes, or how to develop the policy capabilities required to address normative goals like those, how to scale up policy experiments, how to measure outcomes, and so on and so forth. Another aspect that they tend to highlight, which has also been highlighted by Ian and Tatiana, are these cross-government aspects. So how to articulate the place of STI in wider policy discourses and actions on transitions, how to deal with administrative and epistemic silos, and how to seize the opportunities that are currently there in recovery packages, and so on and so forth. And finally, there's another challenge here, is how to face or deal with global challenges with predominantly national responses. In other words, how do we link the national to the global? So in response here, sorry, could you not go so fast, Dimitros? Thanks. So how does the OECD STI policy work respond to these challenges? Well, let's first take a step back and recall the roles of the OECD. Of course, the OECD is best known perhaps for its data, its statistics, but also it does a great amount of research and analysis. And on the basis of those statistics, that research, it often provides guidance and recommendations to governments. Sometimes this is also encapsulated in what we call soft law and recommendations or declarations, for example. And of course, the OECD is also very well known for bringing governments together. So it's a sort of forum where intergovernmental actors and experts convene. But something that's perhaps underappreciated is the OECD's role in framing issues and framing appropriate policy responses. And this is something that Dimitros was mentioning in his slides a moment ago. And of course, in recent years, in the last 30 years, perhaps the most famous framing that the OECD was heavily invested in was the National Systems of Innovation. So 1992, and during the 1990s, a lot of landmark studies published. So these, of course, the OECD didn't invent national systems of innovation. It came from other work, like people like Chris Freeman in the 1980s and even previous to that. But the OECD took those ideas and really very rapidly rolled them out to its member countries. And then in 2015, something that's has been less visible, unfortunately, I would say, has been the Systems Innovation report that Dimitros, while he was at the OECD, worked on extensively. And this, I think this has very much a blueprint, actually, for how we might begin, at least to think about transformative innovation policy. So taking that as our starting point, we're embarking upon what we call a cross-cutting initiative, this S&T Policy 2025. And really the central question here is, how might we put STI policy and the evidence base that informs it on track by 2025 to accelerate long-term sustainability transitions? Next slide. So let me highlight three aspects to this project. First of all, much of the OECD's STI policy work is coordinated by this committee, the Committee for Scientific and Technological Policy, which also has lots of working parties. And this works through what are called biennial work programs. So currently we're in the middle of a biennial work program, and we're planning at the moment for the next one, which will start next year. So there's a lot of existing work that's going on, and this you'll notice that the S&T Policy 2025 project is described as a cross-cutting project. So it's aiming really to pull together all of this work that's going on at the moment. Next slide. So to give you a taste of that work, of course I won't go through this at all, but there on the right-hand side, you have all of the sort of data infrastructures and tools that we have, all of the statistics, the policy databases and STIP Compass, the Outlook, the country innovation reviews. But there on the, so I think we've lost it for a moment. But there on the left-hand side, we have all of this, all of these other projects going on, really a wide range of different activities, really covering a very wide variety of topics, mostly carried out in the various different working parties under the CSTP. So a lot of things going on there, but not necessarily joined up as well as it could be. So next slide. So the idea here behind this project is really to try and pull all of that stuff together, to apply a sort of soft coordination mechanism using common goals, common processes, common templates to try and bring together a whole of system perspective. At the same time, of course, these existing projects and the projects we're planning for the next biennium will populate this whole of system perspective with processes, with evidence, and with practical policy advice. Next slide. The second thing to point out here, so that was the first thing, this is cross-cutting, pulling on what exists already. But the second thing is, of course, this is future-oriented. It's looking at what directions and by what means STI policy needs to move. So we have this little, very simple sort of pathway model there in the top right-hand side. And the main assumption here is that there exist gaps between current STI policy and governance arrangements and those that are required for transitions. And I think what we heard from Ian and from Tatiana confirms that, and also what we hear from our member countries. And bridging these gaps will require a range of reforms, including the sorts of problems policies seek to solve, the groups and the activities targeted by policy interventions, but also the mix and design of policy instruments that are used. But it's important to bear in mind those three perspectives. We're not just here tinkering about policy instruments. We're looking at who's involved, and we're looking at the framing of problems and issues. And of course, here all aspects of STI policy and governance are implicated. So funding, the human resources, infrastructures, and so on. And you may ask, why have we selected 2025, which is only now 3 years out? Well, we recognize, of course, that the transitions we're talking about are much longer term than that, but there's a great urgency to be able to deal with those challenges. And so what we propose to do is to work with our countries to set what we call stretch targets, very short-term stretch targets to 2025, measures that countries can take to ensure that they're on the right paths, if you like, to address some of those longer-term challenges using STI policy. Next slide.
Slowly wrap up, Michael.
Okay, slowly wrap up. Okay, and a third aspect here is that we're talking about multi-level transitions. These raise important STI policy questions. So we're talking about, of course, socio-technical transitions of large-scale systems, but also transitions of STI systems, transitions in policy and governance arrangements, but also crucially transitions in the provision and use of strategic intelligence itself. So these four levels, I think, are important to bear in mind, and each of them offer challenges to us at the OECD and to our member countries and to the analyst community. Next slide. So what does all of this mean in practice? What does the project actually break down into do? It has these three streams of work. So first of all, we're looking to develop what we call Sti Challenge Maps. So these are sort of reference maps of systems and pathways to inform countries' STI policy planning. And they focus on specific STI policy challenges. For example, things like how to design and implement challenge-based funding, how to go about inclusive technology governance, and so on and so forth. These processes, these maps and the like also need to be supported by background foundational papers. So we'll also have a series of those that we will generate over the course of the next year or so. And also we want to reach out to other parts of the OECD to establish cross-governmental outreach activities. Next slide. These are some examples of some of the areas that we need to reform. I've highlighted a few of them in my previous slide. You'll find these on the website. Next slide. And what the idea then, we take these maps and we assemble them into this whole S&T Policy 2025 agenda. Next slide. And then on looking at the third stream, I think this is something important to point out, that we have this cross-government coordination challenge in support of transitions. And the OECD is somehow unique here, that we have all of these different policy areas actually under one roof. So the idea here is to try and reach out to those inside the OECD to begin to organize policy dialogues between the CSDP, for example, and its sister committees, to leverage data infrastructure to see whether we can collect information together, and also to engage with some of these domain visions and roadmaps, priorities they may have, to see where STI fits in. Next slide. I'm nearly done, Sylvia. Okay, so this was the chart I showed earlier. So what does all this mean in practice? If you could just click through quickly, Dimitrios. So we have all of this existing activities going on in the working parties. Then on the right-hand side, we have these things that we'll do inside this cross-cutting project to provide this sort of common elements. And then at the bottom here, we've got a number of outputs, including long-term visions, these maps, perhaps even a new declaration and a ministerial meeting. that will come from all of these processes. Next slide. And just like with the other project, we also have a group of leading distinguished experts advising us on this project. And you also see that Paola and Sylvia are here. Next slide. My final slide. As to the next steps, so this is the concept and the project continue to evolve, and over the next few months we begin to develop some of these challenge maps. We'll complete and commission some of the foundational reports that I mentioned. We'll also reach out to other domain committees in the OECD in the coming weeks, organize some policy dialogues, and then also develop links with related activities such as the JRC activity that Dimitrios mentioned. And then the question, how can you become involved, you as the audience here? Well, we very much welcome hearing from postgraduate students or academics. If they want to help us with this project, do contact me. For example, for postgraduate students, we have internship possibilities, and also policymakers with interest in learning more about what we're doing or even piloting some of the developments that we're working on. Again, please do reach out to me. So thank you very much for your attention. Apologies, I overran it a bit. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael and Dimitrios. I think these are two very interesting and ambitious initiatives, and thank you for presenting them. And I think you provided us with a lot of sort of ideas to pick up on. I would like to turn over now to Elvira and Paola, and actually maybe ask them, listening to both the policymakers and these initiatives, you know, from an academic perspective, what are your reflections in terms of what this means for your work or what you are seeing in the literature, but also for perhaps what these initiatives are trying to tackle? So just your reflections based on the developments you see both in governments at local or regional and national level, but also at the EU level. And then also these initiatives by the OECD and the JRC trying to sort of frame, as Michael said, provide playbooks. And maybe the last point, which we can come back to, there are two comments in the chat that talk about the importance of experimentation, but I don't expect you to cover all, so I'll remind you of that if you wanted to say, because we haven't heard that much perhaps yet about experimentation. So Elvira, if you would like to start. And Elvira is a professor at the University of Manchester, so please go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you for the other presenters. This is a lot of questions. I mean, to give you a bit of background, my interest is mainly on regional innovation policies. So I've been following European regional innovation policy for the last kind of 20 years. So my interest has also always been how innovation can contribute to raising prosperity levels in regional economies, and on innovation policy in less kind of prosperous regions. Given that and given my kind of previous work, I was very sympathetic to what Dimitrios was presenting in terms of how we can build from previous experience in regional innovation policies, smart specialization. I remember studying the RTP and RIS when during my PhD. And one of the criticisms, and it's still kind of 20 years on, some of the criticisms are still there, and partly due to kind of probably narrow frameworks in academia around innovation systems. One of the criticisms of these policies was the lack of attention to the direction of innovation, as we know that. There was a too narrow view of innovation in terms of the types of innovation and also the sources of innovation. And also the policy interventions. We had too narrow a view of government action with kind of silos and as Dimitri was saying, innovation policy is the role of innovation policy actors, and we forget how other aspects have a clear influence. So I think kind of the challenges that were presented and all the activities that Mike and Dimitrios were laying out from the OECD and the European Commission are really welcome, and I think they can provide some new ways to solve these issues. I think providing a more directional approach can both help align different multiple policy priorities and multiple actors across a common vision or narrative. I think what Tatiana was talking about was really key here. And a completely rethink, talking about problems or challenges as the starting point requires a complete reframing of policy action, and also a broadening one as well, looking at not just the production but also the consumption side. And I think as academics we're too used to kind of innovation system frameworks and production side, and I think using multiple levers and using broadening and reframing things can be very advantageous, not just for solving societal challenges, but even also for regional development. You talk about experimentation, and I think often we view regional strengths, like for instance in smart specialization, in terms of technological strengths, scientific strengths, and I think that leaves out a lot of regions. And actually we think about challenges and experimentation, and these can be sources of innovation as well, and regions can be living labs or demonstrators of new solutions of innovations that they can be scaled up subsequently. So I think that's an interesting side of things as well. Tatiana was talking about rural regions, so they all regions have challenges, and not all regions can be innovation, Silicon Valleys. So that is something where I think as academics we need to start changing our focus in terms of kind of how challenges can lead to innovation, and not the other way around, and just looking for solutions, expecting that they can solve all the problems. I think there is a danger that academics, especially, we do like frameworks, we do like neat diagrams, and we need to be very mindful of not adopting kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all narrow frameworks like we've done in the past, and also to consider context. And there was a lot of discussion between the old and the new. So these policies are going to be implemented in regions and localities where, with pre-existing policy mixes, with pre-existing conditions and industrial specializations, and how these are mobilized and reframe and reoriented is key. These policies don't start from scratch. They have to be very smart in kind of redirecting actors and systems. And I really like Tatiana's illustration of that kind of double loop, and how you need not just implementing new systems or develop new systems, but also phase out or replace old practices. And framing is very important here, in terms of how you align multiple interests. We just written a paper about how framing shapes how you understand problems, but also the solutions that might emerge. So this is really key in terms of how you frame things, who you involve, who decides, and also perception of who benefits. So there was also another aspect of, are these agendas complementary? I think you mentioned that at the beginning, Sylvia, in terms of competitiveness and economic growth and sustainability. I think they have to be both. At the regional level, that's the only way in which they might gain legitimacy. so that I think there's a fundamental challenge that these policies moving forward are going to have. That and also the kind of multi-level aspect. And I think where to finish off, where academics can come in and help is, rather than having this maybe tendency towards narrow frameworks, is to focus on this, where the tensions might lie, and the trade-offs might exist between these multiple goals and multiple levels, and also focus on kind of adaptive learning, experimentation, and reflection from existing practices. So I think we need to be more focused on adaptation and implementation, and not so much on designing neat models and frameworks, if you like. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Elvira. I think you touched on a bunch of really interesting points. I think it was really interesting how you mentioned that, you know, there has been a criticism of regional innovation policy or of innovation policy as perhaps neglecting directionality or not having directionality, and then that actually sort of happened maybe in parallel, or, you know, in a parallel universe with the policy actually changing, or whether they're linked. I think that's a really interesting question. And also your focus on regional policy, which again, I think would be interesting to discuss more between the JRC and the OECD initiative. You know, does transformative innovation policy, is it fundamentally different at regional level versus national level, and how do they relate, or should it be different? And finally, as you said, if now innovation policies should really focus more on the problem rather than the policy, does that mean that innovation policies sort of phasing itself out, or it's becoming second place? We hear examples of successful transformative innovation where actually it's not the innovation policymakers that are in the driving seat, right? It's the problem owners, like the Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of Transportation. So I think you raised a ton of really interesting questions that I hope we can come back to. So moving from you, Elvira, to Paula, who, if I may say, who has been focusing a lot on sustainability. So whereas Elvira has been focusing on regional innovation policy and in a larger context, I think, then Paula, I think you've been focusing a lot on sustainability transitions and sort of come to innovation policy from that angle. And you're involved in both of the initiatives that were presented here. So what would be your sort of comments or reflections from what you've heard so far?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yes, indeed, I don't consider myself an expert in innovation policy, but I do have a background in innovation studies, and I'm a sustainability transition scholar, particularly interested in the role of public governance in advancing transitions. And actually, my first touch on innovation policy was over 15 years ago, when we were looking at environmental innovations, and I was interested in how environmental policy issues were integrated into technology policies, because the term innovation policy was not used at the time. And I think I could already see then, and certainly afterwards, that sustainability has been present in some specific innovation programs, but I feel like it's been less on strategic or overall program planning level. And I feel like this is now what's happening. Of course, this is what the academics are arguing for, but also what the OECD and JRC S4 initiatives are showing, that kind of rethinking the whole policy from its strategic level on incorporating the sustainability challenges. And I think this is like very exciting, and I'm really, really glad to be involved in both. So I feel like I could talk about it for a long time because I find it so exciting. But some reflections is that certainly what others have also mentioned is that it's really broadening this idea of policy mixes and what we regard as STI policy mixes. And this then, of course, creates a new coordination challenge for policymaking to kind of tackle the policy silos. And it's not going to be easy, but at least on the EU level, I feel like it is in a way helped by this openness that I see, both talking to people from JRC and the sort of STI policy domain of the EU, as well as the environmental domain, and the European Environment Agency has kind of opened up to innovation and sustainability transition. So I feel like at least on this level, there is this willingness for this dialogue, which is, of course, very helpful when we rethink what it means. However, it's not going to kind of happen overnight, and it's complicating. And I think, and I've done a lot of work on intermediation, and I do think it will require a lot of intermediation between the policy domains and also the different actors, both individuals, but also perhaps kind of organizational changes, thinking what kind of task forces or working groups can happen. And I think there are some examples like the climate kick, but it's of course very just focused on climate issues. So really thinking what would such kind of intermediation mean on this sort of broader level of innovation policy if we want to implement this new kind of thinking. What I also like about both of these initiatives that they show really important developments. They talk about kind of experimental policies that improve public-private collaborations around particular challenges, the regulatory sandboxes, for example. Also, they mention this thinking about funding system restructuring. So we're not only like operating on the level of individual policy instruments or innovations, but really kind of thinking the structure of things, and the funding system restructuring is interesting because there's also this broader debate on the role of finance and finance sector in transformation and transitions. And both also mention this idea of inclusivity and social justice. But I think this is kind of the tricky bit, like how do we concretize it? What kind of, how do we actually address more marginal or vulnerable groups in innovation funding? How do we think about the distribution of benefits? And I noticed there's one comment about how do we address this in kind of less democratic nations. So this is kind of one of the future challenges also for us academics. I wanted to react to some of the comments made by Ian. And I think you mentioned this idea of how like sectoral ministries or sectoral policy domains are taking roles from innovation policy. And this relates to like whether innovation policy is phasing itself out. And I've been studying like the Finnish case of how on mobility as a service and how the transport and communication sector has been the main sector in charge, but there's been a lot of interaction with the National Innovation Agency. So I do still think that the kind of knowledge on the innovation dynamics that is provided by innovation policy and innovation agencies is really important. So I find it hard to see that completely phasing out, but what form it will take, that will be a question. And then, of course, it requires whether there is this openness to change, and these administrative cultures with some certain sectoral ministries might lack, like energy is particularly difficult in that sense. So I don't see it necessarily happening that quickly in all the sectors. And this relates to the academic challenge. And I think there's a lot of academics that are, of course, experts in particular sectors, whether it's energy or transport or buildings or food. And I think that this sort of sectoral interaction required by large-scale transformations presents us academics to this challenge to look at things from cross-system perspectives. And I have a recent personal experience. I've been involved in an EU project that looks at climate change impacts and how those impacts cascade into Europe. But instead of looking at energy or transport, which are my areas of expertise, I've now had to try to understand trade policy and finance policy and security policy. And when I talk to people who work in finance, the whole language is very different. So I think it's really kind of, it will be challenging for both, I think, academics and policymakers. And also, like, there's been invitations now increasingly to interact with social and healthcare sector. And again, it brings like a complete different dynamics and different language. And I also wanted to react to Tatiana about, I really like the point about how you see it's not about avoiding conflict, but how to manage conflict. And I also think this is kind of an area where at least the sustainability transitions community is touching a bit, but I haven't seen that many kind of explicit studies about tensions and conflicts and how do we manage them as part of transitions. And I think this is an interesting area also in connection to transformative innovation policy and what kind of potential conflicts that might create. But yes, I'll end here. I would have other things to say, but I want to leave time for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Paula, for excellent reflections. I also want to apologize. I didn't realize there were more comments. I didn't scroll down. Thanks for picking up on that one too, Paula. I think I think Elvira and Paula have provided us with really good feedback on the points that were made before. I don't know if we can switch back so we can see everybody. I would like to maybe ask if somebody, I think that Lakshya from India poses a very relevant question that Paula picked up on. I think what we've just been discussing, both the JRC and the OECD initiatives, and obviously the experiences from Ian and Tatiana, is all framed within rather developed countries and within countries which have democracies. And as Lakshya is asking, is this, how can you think of transformative innovation policy in a different context, perhaps for countries which are less developed, if you want to say so, or who don't have democratic systems. And I think the flip side of that, which I would like to maybe pose to Ian and Tatiana, is as a policymaker, and I have myself been confronted with that when I worked for the Swedish government agency. We're all talking here about we need a really massive change in how we do things. But do you feel that you have a mandate to do that? Are you, because we're dealing, as also Matthias pointed out, we're dealing with fundamental uncertainties, with managing conflicts, with vested interests, with losers and winners from these transformations, and with the need to sort of experiment and take risks. And one of the side effects of democracy is that there's a lot of accountability, right? That you are supposed to show to voters or society what you're doing with public money and why you're making decisions. So I guess maybe starting with Ian and Tatiana, if you would like to reflect briefly on, do you feel that we talked a lot about, do you have the capacities to make this change in the public sector, but also do you have the knowledge, which I think Elvira and Paula have spoken to very well, but also do you feel like you have the mandate to do what is needed? So maybe I'll start with that question, and then we'll try to fire off one or two more rounds. We have about half an hour left, so if people have questions, please post them in the chat. Who would like to start? Tatiana, do you want to start this time?
A very easy question, no? Okay. I would say that we cannot wait until having this mandate. Who is going to give this mandate? I think that the world has changed so much. If we accept that we live in radical uncertainty and complexity, in this kind of world, so top-down policies don't work anymore, because then who is going to give this mandate? That is a relevant question. I think that the people inside administration, some politicians, I believe much more in coalitions of actors willing to change some things. Not the whole system, because if you say, I'm going to change the whole system, you are going to have lots of oppositions, because transformation is about challenging the dominant system or the regime. So it's impossible to have a mandate from the system to destabilize and open it. So if we talk in terms of transformative innovation policy. So a much smarter way is to look where there are possibilities and to start build these kind of things. And I think that with smart specialization strategies, the European Commission opened a watermelon, because Dimitris has said that we have to put in the center the discovery process. And I believe in this discovery process. And we have a mandate from the European Commission that regions have to open these discovery processes. So I have this mandate because I'm responsible for the smart specialization strategy. And together with the stakeholders in government, of course, with politicians who support these kind of things, we have opened new spaces to start discussing, to look for local places where this kind of processes can start to emerge. And we have opened these spaces, and we are learning from that. And once the people at the local level make these coalitions for change and want to get empowered to have their own decisions, they come to the government and ask for reforms and ask for changing things. And this is like growing and growing. So, but we cannot wait until having the mandate, but who is going to give this mandate? That's my question.
No, that's true. And I guess it ties into what Elvira said, that at the regional level, maybe the difference between national and regional policy, at the regional level, Elvira, as you said, you have to combine, you have to meet both needs, right? Economic viability or sustainability and environmental and social sustainability. And maybe as long as you can do that or show you can do that and are credible, then you have that gives you the mandate. And maybe that's easier at a regional level. Ian, would you like to comment on that too?
Thanks, Sylvia. I'm going to respond in a different way. I think I'm going to link Laxia's question to what Matthias is asking about disruptive technologies, and also to what Johan has just asked about involving private finance. I think Laxia's question about, to my mind, what he's asking is basically, can inclusive transformation occur in non-democratic or in countries that have weak governance structures? I think the link between that and Matthias's question about disruptive technology is that very often even the most richest countries have very weak governance structures when it comes to disruptive emerging technologies. So I think the issue that both of these questions are raising is about the containment or the ethical direction of technologies. Who decides on what is going to go forward? Who decides on the trade-offs that are the consequences as a result of a particular pathway for technology? Who decides on who the losers are and who gets left out? Who decides on who's involved in the conversation so that some excluded voices aren't part of the solution that may bring things in a different direction? So I think that question of the overall ethical and directionality for the entire transformation process is, to my mind, what these questions are bringing up. And I think it becomes quite more complicated still then with what Johan has asked. How do you then involve private finance in that entire process while maintaining that extremely powerful private interests then don't drive the directionality?
Thank you, Ian, for addressing both questions. And I think I think that's exactly the essence of what we're talking about. I don't know if anybody else would like to add something to the comments that were posted in the chat, the other four, or for example, the question, I think you partially addressed that, Ian, about, what does this mean depending on whether you are, who owns the questions and how inclusive is the discussion about what change is desirable. But would anybody else, Michael or Demetrius, or Paula? Sorry, I see Paula and Elvira, so I'll start with you, both of you. So why don't you start, Paula, this time?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this thing that, of course, in democratic countries, I think we suffer from the slowness of change because of the kind of participatory processes, which are important. But at the same time, I still think they're not only about, or maybe not about hearing all voices, but really hearing the most vocal people. And I think this is kind of the challenge for transformative innovation policy, that how do we find the quieter voices or the more marginal groups that are and it's not only innovation policy. I think it's the whole policy making that I feel like we're making decisions based on the most vocal groups who are upset or who are driving for change, and how do we consider the non-heard.
Excellent point. Thank you, Paula. Elvira.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to pick up on that issue of mandates and also pick up on a concept that Demetrius introduced earlier: open entrepreneurial and open discovery process rather than entrepreneurial discovery process, which I think is, I really like that, because it highlights that the multiple voices are required. And so that's one point. And the other is that Tatiana was talking about internal mobilization, but of course, one way of gaining mandate, changing things, is to build alliances outside of the region. And I think interregional cooperation, we did a study looking at this in smart specialization, and found that that's a kind of underused strategy, and cooperation between regions with similar challenges to gain legitimacy and kind of work on common problems that are then kind of brought in or anchored in the region. I think that's another way of going about this discovery process as well.
Thank you, Elvira. There's a follow-up question or a comment in the chat, which I think ties very nicely into a discussion about, in essence, is it easier to drive change, which you have already touched upon in democratic systems with clear winners or losers, or in developing countries? Maybe if we can build on that, and I think we in our preparatory conversation, I think Ian talked about these moving to a more transformative innovation policy is not only very complicated and it's challenging, and it might require new approaches and new capacities, but it's also urgent. So this is something, and I think this ties into some of these things we've already discussed. As you said, Paula, sometimes in democracies, participatory processes are a little bit slower, or processes in general are slower. So how do we handle this urgency that we're facing, this rather existentialist urgency, where perhaps, if I could be a little polemic, we don't have time to wait for researchers to spend 3 years coming up with a good model of how we can approach transformation, and then test it, and then implement it, and roll it out. So I guess this would be my question to you. Is that how do you think about that factor? And how does that, I think Tatiana and Ian touched upon that in their realities that they're dealing with, as Tatiana said, constantly trying to overcome resistance and allowing for the coexistence of old and new. But this urgency, is this something that figures into your work? Is it something that means that we have to do things also differently in the way we interact between academia and policymaking, or in these policy initiatives that Michael and Dimitris are describing? Michael, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Sylvia, for the question. I mean, it's a big concern that we have. We feel that we're going too slow in this project, for example, which has now been going for a year, where we've been mostly talking and planning and building those coalitions. But 2025 comes nearer and nearer by the day. So we have this idea, of course, to have these stretch targets, but we still are not close to implementing them. We haven't really started doing that much analyses yet. So yeah, it's a big concern for us. And we do have this window of opportunity now, going back to some of the remarks about mandates earlier on. I'm not sure we'd have been able to do this project if it hadn't been for COVID and the climate crisis, which have really blown up over the last couple of years. So there is that window of opportunity now that does give us some space inside the OECD, but how long will it remain open? That's also a concern.
Thanks a lot, Michael. That's very relevant. Tatiana.
I would say that maybe it's politically incorrect to say that, but as I said, we cannot wait for mandate, we cannot wait for consensus, because it's impossible to make transformation from consensus. So I think that this open space that has provided, for example, smart specialization strategies, promoting this open discovery processes, and start building niches, start experimenting, but with researchers and policymakers looking at these experiments, learning from them, and what is interesting and can become an alternative, helping it to grow. So it's like the tipsy narrative is perfect. No, you build the niches, you expand them, and then very important, this interaction between niches and the dominant system. Because what we have seen is that without a change of mentality, it's impossible to change anything. So the most urgent thing is to change the mindsets and to change the narratives and start doing things. And there are many actors that are already doing things. Then we have to visualize them and to connect these things that are happening with the policymakers, and researchers have to look more at the local things that are happening, because many researchers or international institutions are talking a lot with politicians, But many politicians are so far away from what is really happening on the ground, and many policymakers also are civil servants many times. So because many things are happening and many times we are not seeing them. And I think that we need to rethink all that. But changing mentalities and mindsets and changing narratives is the most important issue, because without that, it's impossible to change anything, I would say.
Thank you, Tatiana. And that's a super relevant point, changing mindsets and changing narratives, but those usually take time, right?
Start experimenting at the same time.
Yes, that's true. And experimenting in the media. Yep, that's a good point. Anybody else would like to comment on this urgency dimension? Dimitrios?
Yeah, I very much share the sense of urgency, and it pains me that we cannot make faster progress. I think the window of opportunity that Michael mentioned is now open, but won't stay open forever. And it pains me also that this is a momentous occasion to, as we are revamping our house, so to speak, to change how the furniture are organized, to repurpose old rooms into new uses, and to change society for the better. It pains me that this is not done. I think we have some of the mental models. We don't have all the answers. I'm not arguing for a moment that we have even the beginnings of the answers necessary, but we have some of the mental models to begin to work together to do this, to work with stakeholders. I think one of the defining characteristics of transitions, what we've learned from sustainability transitions literature, is distributed agency. That agency, and by extension, that agency is distributed among several players, but power is not distributed evenly, and this is really what we need to manage in this transition, and what we need to help policymakers everywhere from our respective positions at the interfaces between research and policy at the OECD and at the JSC, to provide them with the tools to engage with stakeholders, to have relevant evidence bases, so that everyone who needs to take decisions, not just governments, but the stakeholders themselves, the companies, the users, the patients in hospitals, we can begin with the problems. We can begin with the problems and work backwards. And these are very big challenges.
And that also ties into what you, Tatiana, said in another conversation. And also, Elvira, you know, this flip that you really just, policies, it's like secondary. It's what is the problem rather than talking about the policy. So we're running out of time quickly. We have 13 minutes left. If anybody would like to post a question or a comment, please do so. I would like to do a round with all of you and ask what you would like to comment on before we wrap up. I'm going to throw out 2 questions, which you can totally ignore and just talk about what you want. But I just, in case, one is to Ian and Tatiana, since you are people who are constantly crossing over, it seems, between the research that's out there and the knowledge and also the policy. Is there any requests you would have to Michael or Dimitris or also to Elvira and Paula as sort of representatives of the academic community, where where would you like more research being done, or where would you need more support from the analysis or academic side? That would be one question that I have. And then another question is this conflict. Elvira said there isn't necessarily or so much a conflict at the regional level. The traditional innovation policy, which promotes competitiveness, has to coexist with the sort of newer framing of innovation policy, which is more transformational. But is there a friction perhaps at the national level or at the supranational level? And is it even meaningful still to talk about innovation policy? Or since we were really essentially talking about driving quite fundamental economic, societal, and institutional change. So those would be what I'm sort of thinking about listening to you. Sorry, thank you. I was just told there is a question in the chat. I'm sorry It's late on a Friday evening. Okay. So sorry for overburdening you. I hope you can keep your concentration. The question from Jonas, could the participants reflect on what are the most urgent points? All right, that's a little bit what I was talking. What are the most urgent points for research and action agenda for our community? So maybe tying a little what I was trying to say, but phrased much better. And how do we quickly accomplish the transitions knowledge to those working in the field? I mean, I think again, how do we get the knowledge across quickly, and what kind of knowledge is needed? Maybe we can start with these. I know I've already dumped a lot on you. Who would like to start?
So would you like me to go, Sylvia?
Go ahead, Ian, please.
So I think in answer to Jonas' question about the research and action agenda for the community, I think I'd have the same answer as to Michael and Demetrius. And it's about framing. Yeah. It's about how we frame our work, how we frame that research agenda, how you frame the two initiatives that we've heard today. Yeah? And I think the most fundamental reframing that we need is the one I alluded to at the end of my opening remarks. That when we talk about innovation, we're talking about a subsystem that is deeply connected as the questions come up about democracy and so forth, about disruptive technologies and who has the power to say what goes forward or not. The innovation system is deeply interconnected with the broader economic system, which is deeply interconnected with politics, with economics, deeply interconnected, as Lakshya has just said, with faith and beliefs, yeah, with gender, with education systems, yeah. And the question of whether we can move fast enough, there's also a danger of moving very quickly to somewhere we don't want to be, yeah, to exacerbating the problems we currently have, yeah. I think both in Johan Schott's work with Laura Kanger and in the work that we're doing on deep institutional innovation, yeah, the fundamental assumption is that all of these institutions are deeply broken. We need the landscape of values that we're operating in is deeply flawed. Yeah? So we need to be asking, what is it that we're trying to change? What is it are we trying to innovate? It's not a specific technology. It's not bringing a technology to market. It's about the values that we have as a society, the values that are leading us, and the institutions that we have that are currently in need of reimagining. That may take a very long time, but that's the framing that we should be putting everything within.
I could continue if you want.
Please. Yeah. Thank you, Ian.
Okay. I think new narratives and new frameworks and new framing is the basic thing, and changing mindsets, because without changing mindsets, it's impossible to do these new frameworks. Then changing mindsets, elaborating new frameworks, but start to action with experimentation. So we cannot wait until having them, as you say, but we have to, it's not one thing after the other. We need to start doing different things, and especially changing the relation and how we work together, researchers and policymakers. And I think that institutional organizations have a very big responsibility and a very big role in changing the narratives and shifting these pathways, because what the question about investment and about financing. So financing, if there are opportunities and the directionality is clear, it goes there. So the first thing is directionality, changing mindsets, starting experimenting, and learning to work together in different ways, policymakers with researchers, because they have a big responsibility in order to change things. So this would be my...
Thank you very much, Tatiana. Who else would like to make their... Go ahead.
I think one key challenge and challenge for me personally, linked to my current work, is what Dimitri was talking about in terms of flipping the way we think and starting from challenges and problems, and how that can lead to innovation. And that's not straightforward. It involves looking at how the challenges can lead to demands, and the demands can lead to can have potential to create or save markets. I mean, the current work that I'm doing around public procurement is precisely around that, and it's not just about buying stuff. It's about framing the problem, framing what do we want to get to, and what are the outcomes we want to achieve, and also what are the values. So shifting the thinking from value to values, and that I think is fundamental, and something that can be done at the regional level, as Tatiana was saying, with coalition of actors that can also start to reconcile the multiple objectives and conflicting missions, if you like. So that reconciling the value and values and kind of from bottom up and aligned with the kind of more top-down policies. I think for me, because at the end of the day, you need to scale up those things to achieve change. So those for me are key challenges.
Thanks a lot, Elvira. I've been told we have 5 more minutes, and so we have Paula, Michael, and Dimitrios for your final comments.
Thanks. I'm trying to reflect on Jonas's question, and I think for me, really the next step would be also for us academics as well as for policymakers to develop concrete enough frameworks or models that are actually useful for policy, but at the same time don't dilute the kind of core ideas of transformation. And for us academics, I think we really need kind of to connect the theory and concepts with real world cases and empirical research. And of course, the problem has been quite a long time that we don't yet have that many good examples of transformative policies, but the JRC and OECD work provide an interesting setting. And I think we need to kind of then also look more locally for concrete cases that could illustrate what works and how. And then for the JRC and OECD, I think I just wanted to say that I think a lot of academics really like to be useful. And also I think many of us are happy to be contacted and be sort of ask questions from our research or try to translate it. Of course, we don't always have the time, but at least I've found that maybe there's been a bit of a barrier, especially for more junior researchers, that they're perhaps too afraid to contact policymakers. And I don't know what policymakers think about it, but whenever I've been approached, I'm most of the time really happy to have been asked, because I'm not just doing things for academic curiosity, but for real world impact or help.
Thank you, Paula. Dimitrios, would you like to?
I'm full of questions myself. I've taken many notes. But I think a key question that is very important for the member states and for the European Commission is what are the new kinds of what are the new tasks for policy in general, and what are the kinds of policy additionality to empower perhaps the voices that are not heard. This is a very important policy task, and this is really something that will not be done. And there's a duty for public policymakers. It's a duty for policymakers to make sure it happens. And this is where this forms of participatory governance in development strategies can play a role to allow these niches to emerge. But there are probably many other tasks. We've only begun to scratch the surface. So I think I would issue a collective call to the TIP community to keep identifying new tasks for public policy.
Thank you, Dimitrios. Michael.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on that last point that Dimitrios made, I mean, also to reiterate the appreciation we have for the TIP community. I mean, a lot of the ideas there, the papers on the website, they've been very influential in the work that we've been doing in the OECD. But just to Jonas's point, I mean, I think it's been raised already. I think the critical thing is that we need to look at STI policy within the context of sectors, of other domains that are not necessarily just industrial sectors, of other sort of systems like food systems, energy systems, and the like. That's really an important starting point in many ways. that also, I mean, that, as Elvira highlighted, brings in the demand side, the consumption aspects, besides just the production of science and innovation. But the interesting thing as well is that there's a great amount of STI activities in sectors like health, energy, transport, and so on as well, which I don't sense that we're very well linked with in the mainstream STI policy. So I think that's important that we try and make those linkages as well.
Thank you, Michael. I think we're out of time. To me, this has been a super rich discussion. I want to thank you all for providing really excellent input. And I would sum it up as the challenge that lays ahead of us is that we have to run while we think and feel while we're running. And how we do that, I think, is what we've been trying to sort of answer. And I guess I leave you with, are we still talking about innovation policy? ? It seems to me a lot bigger. So thank you so much. I hope everybody had the energy to listen. I wish you all a good evening, and thanks a lot to the panelists for this discussion.